Hello, everyone. The Thing About Witch Hunts welcomes you to our Building a Global Response to Witch Hunts expert panel. We are so glad you chose to spend this time with us. I'm Josh Hutchinson, co-founder of US-based nonprofit In Witch Hunts. Thank you all for joining us to hear from the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks on their important work challenging witchcraft accusations that lead to violence.
Hello, I'm Sarah Jack, also a co-founder of End Witch Hunts. Today, you will learn about the new report released June 2025 called Legislative Approaches to Addressing Harmful Practices Related to Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks. You will learn about efforts to end literal witch hunts, the challenges faced by communities worldwide, and the power of connecting experts, practitioners, advocates, and survivors across borders to create meaningful change.
Hello, I'm Mary Bingham, co-founder of End Witch Hunts. The three of us share a personal connection to this work. We are all descendants of people accused of witchcraft in Salem in 1692.
Today, our panelists are Professor Charlotte Baker, co-director of the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks, and a member of the UK National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. From 2015 to 2021, she worked with Ikpanwoza Arrow, former independent expert on the rights of persons with albinism, and Gary Foxcroft of the Witchcraft and Human Rights Information Network to lead work to secure Resolution 47.8 on the elimination of harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks in July 2021. Charlotte Baker is professor of French and Critical Disability Studies in the Department of Languages and Cultures at Lancaster University, UK. Charlotte's research interests focus on the representation of marginalized and stigmatized groups in sub-Saharan Africa, theories and representations of disability.
We also have Professor Miranda Forsyth, professor and socio-legal researcher at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University and director of the International Network Against Accusations of Witchcraft and Ritual Attacks. Her research focuses on legal pluralism, restorative justice, crime, and peace, with a particular emphasis on Melanesia. Since 2013, she has led a research agenda on overcoming sorcery accusation-related violence in Papua New Guinea, contributing numerous articles and resources to the field.
And finally, Dr. Keith Silika is a remarkable criminal investigator and lecturer whose work bridges the worlds of criminology, forensics, and human rights advocacy. Born in Zimbabwe, Dr. Silika grew up around traditional healing practices through his father, who was both a healer and a devout Catholic. His career has taken him from work with the Zimbabwe Republic Police to law enforcement and academics in England, and he is an expert in AI research.
End Witch Hunts is a nonprofit dedicated to educating the public about both historical and contemporary witchcraft persecution. We raise awareness about harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks through public awareness campaigns and podcast conversations with advocates, academics, and leaders involved in the cause. Org and pull that report up.
Before we hear from our incredible panel of experts, let's understand what survivors of witchcraft accusations face around the world.
Witchcraft accusations are still a major problem with devastating consequences for victims, including physical violence, social ostracization, economic deprivation, psychological trauma, and even death.
Harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft are cases when someone harms another person whom they suspect has bewitched them, their kin, or their property. Women, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities are disproportionately targeted.
In 2021, the UN Human Rights Council adopted Historic Resolution 47/8 on the elimination of harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. The first resolution of its kind, calling for a holistic approach to addressing these violations across the globe.
This brings us to why we're here today. Leaders from the global network, the International Network against witchcraft accusations and ritual attacks, INAWARA, will share how their organization unites research, expertise, and collaborators from around the world to combat witchcraft accusations and ritual violence.
Now let's hear from our expert panelists. Welcome Professor Charlotte Baker, Professor Miranda Forsyth, and Dr. Keith Silika. Please introduce yourselves and tell us your backgrounds.
I'm Professor Charlotte Baker. I'm based at Lancaster University in the northwest of England. And my career is focused on disability and particularly albinism. And that's what brought me to this issue of harmful practices associated with belief in witchcraft. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of this podcast.
I'm Miranda Forsyth, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I am based at the Australian National University, and I've been working on the issue of what we call sorcery accusation-related violence, or SARV, in Papua New Guinea since 2013, and I joined the International Alliance since about 2017.
Good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Keith Silika. I'm based in Salford University. I was born in Zimbabwe, where I work for the police there, and my current research interest is around artificial intelligence and witchcraft practices, and I'm currently writing a monograph on witchcraft practices in a forensic context. Thank you.
What is the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks?
So the International Network Against Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks, which we call INAWARA for short, was formed in 2022 in order to connect the different groups and initiatives that are working on this issue around the globe. So after the resolution was passed in 2021, we became aware that a lot more needed to be done in order to mean that it was going to have a real impact in practice. And that would involve seeking to connect all of those different groups who are working often in quite isolated ways by themselves in different countries, to connect them together so that they could learn from each other, support each other. And we did this following the ending of the previous organization, which was the Witchcraft Human Rights Information Network, that has done so much fantastic work for a number of years, but came to an end. And so we've taken its place. The blog posts on our website are one of the ways that we're seeking to connect people. We're also doing advocacy, raising awareness, and one of the ways that we're doing that is through a photography exhibition that is being taken around to different places to make people aware that it's not just in one country, that this is a global problem. We're seeking to share knowledge as well about how these forms of harmful practice emerge in different places, and also to gather and to share data about the enormity of the problem, really, because people are generally not aware of how widespread and how systematic it is. So we're working on a global dashboard at the moment.
What is the significance of the report you released this June, Legislative Approaches to Addressing Harmful Practices Related to Witchcraft Accusations and Ritual Attacks? And what have you discovered about legislative approaches?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question as well. We started looking at legislation really because it's often something that policymakers and politicians discuss as a way of responding to the problem of witch hunts or harmful practices related to witchcraft when there's a lot of pressure on them to do something. You know, it's like, okay, then we can enact some new laws. And we thought, okay, let's find out how many countries actually have enacted specific legislation to address the issue, how many countries are really using just usual criminal laws to prosecute the kinds of abuses that occur in the name of harmful practices, and what impact have those laws actually had on the phenomenon. So on a positive note, we found that, in fact, there's been 15 countries around the world that have enacted specific legislation to address harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attack. whereas most countries are using general criminal laws to prosecute these harmful practices. So murder, grievous bodily harm, arson, etc. And we also found that some countries have enacted legislation that is particularly targeted at the activities of individuals who create fear around witchcraft, such as diviners, or those who exploit belief in witchcraft for financial gain, such as so-called witch doctors. Generally, those rules we found, those laws were having impact in terms of, the signaling message that they were sending. We found that in general, the laws had not been actually used in practice to a great deal to prosecute these harmful practices. So what we've learned from that really is that enactment of legislation is not alone sufficient to address the problem. We also found that it was quite difficult to gather this information because courts and the justice system and media as well often don't reference belief in witchcraft as being a feature of the case. And so it's difficult just through reading through case decisions or looking at police reports to know whether or not a particular case is related to a belief in witchcraft. And we also found very distressingly that some countries continue to treat a belief in witchcraft as a mitigating factor in relation to the commission of criminal offences. And so will give lighter sentences in those cases. And in fact, some countries are actively prosecuting so-called alleged witches through state courts. So what we really concluded in the report is that there needs to be a package that is built around any kind of legislative initiative that helps to support victims and really also brings awareness and education to those in the justice system who are responsible for implementing it. This all requires both political will and also adequate resourcing, which often are not packed around these legislative initiatives, unfortunately. But unless you have that, then we don't think that legislation alone is going to be the silver bullet that people often hope that it is.
It's such a wonderful report to use and look at. It's not only is the data so significant, it's readable and shareable. So I really encourage everybody to go to the internationalnetwork.org and pull that report up. You can download it and use that to help share what's happening. What can you tell us about the United Nations Human Rights Council Resolution 47.8 adopted on July 12, 2021 that was titled Elimination of Harmful Practices Related to Accusations of Witchcraft and Ritual Attacks?
So I'm going to take that question. So the resolution addresses the human rights violations that Miranda mentioned that are rooted in accusations of witchcraft and also the ritual attacks and harmful practices that are linked to such accusations and beliefs. So the resolution calls for action. It calls for states and for other stakeholders to take measures to eliminate these harmful practices, to protect the people who are vulnerable, and to ensure accountability by strengthening data, engaging with research, and working together with different stakeholders. The resolution was tabled in response to the different harmful practices that affect often the most vulnerable people in society: women, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. And the resolution makes clear that the point isn't to ban belief in witchcraft, but actually to target the practices that are harmful and that amount to violations of fundamental human rights. So the resolution is a landmark resolution in many ways because it placed the issue of witchcraft-related accusations and ritual attacks explicitly on the agenda of the UN human rights machinery. And it's just the beginning of the journey, but it was an important point in time that marked the recognition of this issue and its severity at that international level.
What next steps does the resolution call for?
So our aim with the resolution was to address the issue at the highest level. And as Miranda said, we know there's a lot of grassroots work going on, but the challenge now is to join everything up. And I think that's something that the resolution is pushing towards. It includes some very clear next steps for governments, for UN bodies, and also for civil society. It called, most importantly, for the protection of people who are accused or those who are at risk, for those vulnerable groups. It calls for the recognition of these human rights abuses as crimes, and therefore it calls on states to investigate and to prosecute and to end the impunity that has been the sort of current state of affairs for many, many years. It also emphasizes the importance of stakeholders working together and also of working with communities, engaging with them to promote positive change where harm is occurring. It asks governments and UN agencies and researchers to work together to raise awareness of this issue, to collect reliable data, which is really lacking at the moment. And I think the report that Miranda spoke about and the database are really positive steps towards addressing that issue of data. Also to identify the root causes and to train those who might encounter this issue who are on the front line. So we're thinking about police and social workers, legal professionals, for example. And we're already beginning to see the impact of the resolution. We can see that some states are reviewing witchcraft laws, often because the resolution has been used to encourage that action by members of civil society. And we've also heard calls for change from a range of different stakeholders around the world. So the resolution is starting to have an impact, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. The International Network collaborates with many partners around the world. How does working together strengthen efforts to eliminate harmful practices?
I'll take this one. Yeah, the network, by working with different partners, it helps collaboration and helps bridge gaps between local realities and global frameworks, something that Miranda and Charlotte have already mentioned. And also we try and make links with field non-governmental organizations. For example, I'm very much in touch with the African Albino Network. Actually, next year when I do my yearly charity rounds, I'll actually be doing some fundraising for the African Albino Network. And also by working with other organizations, we have what called unified advocacy, because networks such as INAWARA give smaller organizations legitimacy, international spaces by using also the legislation that's already available. In addition, collective advocacy transformed fragmented efforts, because as you can see, based on the report and based on our work, there's very much fragmented efforts around how to address witchcraft practices in different parts of the world, using different legislation, different approaches. So working with different organizations kind of bridges that gap in that context, if that makes sense.
Thank you. It's really working to express the scale and urgency of witch hunts. What are the most impactful ways that individuals, organizations, or institutions can support INAWARA's work?
Who'd like to start? Shall I go first?
Yeah, you go first. I'll come up there.
Yeah, I'm sure Miranda and Keith will chip in. I think the most important thing is talking about it, is raising awareness of this issue, even in our own communities. And you know, I often have this conversation here in the UK. I'm invited to go and give a talk about witchcraft, and people expect a sort of historic focus to it, which I give them. But then when I start to discuss the contemporary issue and how it intersects with issues of child abuse, for example, then people really become interested and they really start to engage in the issue and realize that this is part of the world that we live in. and that this is something that needs to be addressed. So I think talking about it, educating people about it is important. I also think that having the network is really valuable. I think the way in which we bring people together around the table, and this is something that your organization does really successfully as well. And I think we need to work collaboratively on this. We need to work together as much as possible. And I guess the final thing is to keep chipping away to make an impact. So making sure that the resolution actually makes a difference. Because if we don't actively try and make it do something, then it just sits there and it won't make any change at all. So I think they're the three things I would point to. But Miranda or Keith, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, I would add most of the things that you just mentioned as well. We need to amplify the awareness and advocacy because so many countries are still have witchcraft practices in their laws and books. And also for me, based on my research, to support capacity and training initiatives, particularly around safeguarding the individuals, but as well know the witchcraft film Hindoki highlighted the gaps around safeguarding individuals who are accused of witchcraft. And also a secondary element that I'm very much interested in is the forensic aspect in terms of investigation and training on frontline individuals who come across individuals who have been accused of witchcraft. So that's where we come in some of the projects that me and Charlotte will be working on in part of my monograph. In addition to, as Charlotte and Miranda mentioned, we've got the legislation in certain countries and we've got the UN resolution. Most UN resolutions around harmful practices such as, say, mass graves also come with what we call protocols, investigation protocols. So that's where we want individuals like myself and others who can join in to look at investigation protocols around witchcraft and harmful practices because they've got a double-edged sword in terms of prevention, detection, and investigation.
Yeah, and maybe just the only thing to add to what my colleagues have said is in terms of resources and support for, the thing that we're seeking to do in the network is these seed funding programs to really try to channel small amounts of funding to organizations that are doing amazing work, but who often are so far below the radar that they don't have access to donors. And so additional support in terms of, we would love to have a couple of donors that we can ask for regular support so we can do that channeling work. At the moment, we don't have any, and that does hamper the extent of work that we can do in that regard.
Now we will hear from each of you individually about your advocacy focus. Professor Charlotte Baker, please tell us about your advocacy work.
Thank you. So I guess my advocacy is very much focused on the disabled community and about raising awareness of this issue of witchcraft-related accusations and harmful practices. And so what I've been really keen to do is make sure that those participants are really front and center in the advocacy work that I've done, that they're not an afterthought, that we don't pursue our own agendas and leave them behind, as it were. So I think it's really important that when we do advocacy work, we work with our stakeholders very much at the forefront of it.
And Professor Forsyth, thank you for your advocacy. Please tell us about your work in this area.
Thanks so much. So I would say that my advocacy is very much entwined with my work as an academic in this space. So I have that, two-pronged approach really. And I've been primarily focused on Papua New Guinea, where the issue of sorcery accusation-related violence really, I think, came to global attention in 2013. And that led then a lot of pressure on the government to do something about the problem. There was a national action plan on SARV that was passed in 2015. And so my research has really sought to follow that agenda to see what kinds of changes were being made and to try to document the cases and the types of harm as well that were arising around Papua New Guinea. Since that time, I think that what we've really seen is both, unfortunately, fortunately a rise in awareness of the issue in Papua New Guinea. SARV is now accepted as being one of the most significant human rights problems facing the country, along with gender-based violence and intergroup fighting as well. However, there's also has not been a diminution in the number of cases, and it seems that actually it is on the rise in quite a number of parts of the country, particularly up in the highlands. And so my work has been to try to work with local research organizations and also local activists to raise attention to that, particularly looking at the moment, I'm focusing on the way in which sexual violence is part of the kind of torture that occurs once somebody is accused of witchcraft or sorcery in Papua New Guinea. I'm also interested in looking at the ways in which elections involve narratives of sorcery and how that feeds into sorcery accusation related violence, but also how these beliefs and concepts of sorcery are used during elections in order to cause fear and to embed particular understandings about sorcery in ways that are really not at all helpful to our agenda. I've also been working with some fantastic local groups who have been developing a community curriculum to really address the problem from a prevention perspective. There's a lot of work that's done in terms of responding to these cases, but really what our research has shown is that there needs to be a tremendous amount more work done at that prevention level, because that's where you can really stop these cases from getting started in the first place. And so the theory of change behind this community curriculum is that in order to stop these cases, you need to work within communities with trusted leaders in that community to hold conversations with local community members to really cast doubt on whether or not narratives of sorcery are credible, whether when a misfortune occurs, people should be actually looking for alternative explanations as to what went wrong rather than seeking to blame and to use violence. And so my colleague Anton Lutz, who I think might have been on this program as well, he rolled out a pilot of looking at that community curriculum, working mostly with pastors in Enga province earlier this year. And I was fortunate enough to participate in some of those sessions. And the initial results were very promising. It's now being rolled out in Simbu province. And again, I'm just, walking alongside, trying to document what impact this is having and then sharing that with the rest of the world so that we can all jointly contribute to thinking about what can we do to really stop these cases from occurring in the first place. Okay, I've probably spoken too much. I'm happy to answer any further questions about that, but I'll hand over to Keith.
Yeah, Keith, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Charlotte and Dr. Miranda. And Keith, we would love to hear about your advocacy.
Yes, as I mentioned, in my previous podcast here, my advocacy is around forensics, safeguarding and policing, because we have the legislation, we have idea of some numbers, we have locations. So I want to go back to basics using my policing background. I want to look at offender characteristics. Within the context of Southern African witchcraft practices, by the way, I want to look at offender practices, victim practices, locations, patterns of behavior, because that will inform kind of what we call the investigation framework. If we see this pattern of behavior, we're going to look at this area and we're going to use this legislation. So I basically want to connect the dots. So recently as I mentioned in my previous contribution, I've been commenting on the Zambian witchcraft trial that's been ongoing in terms of legislation, particularly around the evidence and also the objects that were used within that context. And also within my monograph, I'm also finding, as Miranda mentioned, there's different approaches to resolving these issues. In Southern Africa, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, there's opportunities around what we call friendship benches, where local trained aunties can offer some sort of intervention within local cultural context based on a local cultural issue. So my advocacy is around those particular issues, mainly forensics, safeguarding, investigation, prevention, and other advocacy that I can support Charlotte and Miranda in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you guys would like to share about what the network has done or what you have coming up or anything we might not have touched on today?
One thing we haven't discussed is our sort of bringing people together, I guess, in different ways. And Miranda mentioned the photo exhibition. We've been involved in supporting expert meetings. We've also held a couple of conferences now, and we're just at the stage of planning another one next year. And I know that's something that you've participated in, which has been brilliant. But these are real opportunities to bring stakeholders together, to have really difficult conversations. Sometimes, back at one of our early conferences, we spent 3 days talking about terminology. That's what it came down to, deciding whether we should use the word witchcraft or not. We had interventions from people from all different backgrounds, from the church, from pagan organizations, academics from different disciplines, members of civil society groups. And that was a really productive discussion because it was agreed that we would go with the witchcraft word, even though it was recognized that this isn't the term that's used internationally. And Miranda's already mentioned salve, for example. So there are different terms in use. But yeah, these conferences have been really valuable, I think, in bringing people together in different ways.
Yeah, and maybe, so if I just elaborate on 2 initiatives that we've been working on as well this year. The first one, as I mentioned, was this global database. As part of the advocacy work that we did in 2019, in the lead up to the resolution, then we did research, online research mostly, to try to find where are these cases and how can we put some numbers around them, because that's often what policy makers listen to. But we're conscious that we really need to update that. And it would be fantastic to have an online portal where people can see how many cases are occurring in different countries around the world. What is the form that they take? What kind of characteristics do their victims, typical victims, have? And who are the groups who are doing work in trying to address that? So we are developing a global dashboard, first of all, putting in all of that information that we gathered back in 2019, which was, we found that there were 20,000 cases globally. So there's a lot of information that needs to go in. We've got some fantastic interns working on that, but then setting up systems so that we can include all of the new cases that are reported online. And ideally, we would love to be able to set up a system whereby different NGOs around the world or different organizations that are gathering data are able to input their data into our system so that we can jointly bring it together and show the enormity of the problem. And that would really give a lot of support to our advocacy efforts to have this as a very serious human rights abuse, really given the support that it needs. The second thing that we've been working on is developing a competition for an art competition for schools, because we want children to be aware that that this issue exists. Of course, it's a difficult issue to discuss with children because it involves fairly horrific violence. But we've really thought hard about that and thought about the fact that what is often going on in these cases is the othering, the kind of scapegoating of particular individuals. And that is a very, very familiar pattern even to school children. And so raising awareness of the way in which that occurs and the problems that it leads to is something that we thought we could do through our schools competition. So that also is being developed. And we're hoping that that will be another way of spreading awareness of the problem of this issue.
Thank you. And thank you, attendees, for sharing this time with us today. And please put your questions in the chat. And I'm sure that any of our wonderful people that were here with us today will do their best to answer. Thank you.
Here we go. We have one. This is great. Does INAWARA work with groups on relief efforts? So you would say that there are those in the network that is their advocacy, is relief efforts.
100%. I would say that what we do is we seek to support frontliners who are doing that, who are working in the sort of the care and response space. And we do that through advocacy. As we mentioned earlier, we had some seed funding earlier this year, and we gave that to some of those frontline agencies. But we are not providing direct support ourselves to those. And we would like to do a lot more of that. But as I mentioned, we don't have any benefactors at the moment. And so we're limited to the extent that we can do it.
Yeah. Before I go to the next question, I just want to comment as a descendant of women who were in court for witchcraft in the 17th century. This global effort and campaign just really, it's on my mind every day. All that's happening on the ground and the coming together. And I'm so grateful for INAWARA because for us here in the U.S., it really helped us understand what we needed to collect for data. And I feel like the network really helps us all be more creative and recognize what we have in common, even though there's so much context difference. So here in the US, we've been tracking spiritual and ritual abuse, often in the form of violent exorcisms against vulnerable individuals. So I'm really thankful to the network for how you bring us all together and how this data is really going to build that bigger picture. So what an incredible portal of information that would be when that is able to come to fruition. We have a question. Why in this day and age are people still being killed for witchcraft?
I can chip in the context of mine and just briefly. Anyway, within the context of Southern Africa, witchcraft practices persist because of poverty. And for me, that's the number one driving factor within the areas that I look at, because if you look at the places like Malawi, Zambia, there's loads of poverty, lack of education, lack of social amenities, and lack of even access to information or certain types of information. So those areas, those kind of conditions foster witchcraft practices around like, oh, my goats have not done well this season. My son is not able to go to school, or any kind of business activity is not going well, or anything in life that can be attributed to things that are normally attributed in other societies. And then they get dressed up as, witchcraft. And then those conditions then persist.
I agree. I think it's in the absence of healthcare provision. It's in context, low-income context. In a sense, it can be seen as a kind of scapegoating as people try to fill the gap that's left. So leaders may identify a witch to restore the social order. So these killings, we know they occur when there are weak legal systems, when you have strong traditional or religious pressure, and also certain circumstances within communities that mean that people aren't willing to stand up and to defend those who are being accused. And yes, they happen when things go wrong, when there's a sudden illness in the family, or the crops fail, or community conflict. Miranda mentioned election time, and certainly for people with albinism, when they're attacked, then election periods are times of particular vulnerability. But I'm sure Miranda can add some other examples from her own experience.
Yeah, I would also say that these fears are often manipulated and exploited by individuals seeking to obtain financial rewards or achieving certain kinds of powers. And so these people take different forms across the world. As a general group, we call them spiritual entrepreneurs. And they often use religious or traditional divination practices to purport to identify witches or sorcerers, for financial reward. And this really intensifies the amount of violence and the amount of fear. So that's why, for example, in Papua New Guinea, there's been legislation that has targeted these individuals who are called glass man or glass Mary to try to stop this fear propagation. I think in parts of Africa, that takes on more of a religious dimension, with the pastors claiming to exercise children in particular. And so holding these kind of individuals accountable is really important. But as Charlotte said, unfortunately, impunity is generally the name of the day, and people think that they can get away with it.
Following up on the above, or on that question, is the why different in different areas, or how are reasons similar globally?
I mean, the extraordinary thing that we found is how similar the patterns are, both across the world and across history. You just see there is a misfortune, then there is a weak or vulnerable individual, and then that leads to an accusation, which then builds up. Sometimes that build up happens slowly, sometimes it happens incredibly quickly. And so you've got the community against an individual. That pattern is very prevalent, and it happens at times of economic precarity, uncertainty. People are looking for an explanation, and so they reach for one that gives a sense of control. And if you can identify an individual and take some action against them, then it does provide that sense of control. I should say that also in my research in Papua New Guinea, there is a class of case that is slightly different to that, in terms of it's the more economically successful who are being identified. And you might have a person who's come in and to a different province and set up a business, and that business is doing very well. Then they might also be the target of accusation, even though you wouldn't say, oh, that person is vulnerable. Because they are doing better than other people around them, then that creates jealousy. And jealousy is also a driver of accusation, because people are seeking again to understand, well, why are they succeeding and I'm not succeeding?
And we have a comment from Carolyn Gent at Stop Child Witchcraft Accusations Coalition, how much they've really valued working with Miranda and her colleagues at ANU to write up research on children's views and experience. And you did touch on how difficult this can be, but we have talked to Carolyn on the podcast before, and it is really amazing the work that is being done around children witchcraft accusations. Does anybody want to say any more on that?
I might just elaborate on that. And I think that Carolyn has pointed out this really great potential in the network, because we are often connected with many academics, and NGOs are often gathering data that they want to do something with. And so this was an opportunity that I had to work with Carolyn and her fantastic team at Stop Child Witch Accusations, where they had gathered data trying to understand, how do children think about witchcraft accusations and the nature of witchcraft, so that they could then use those understandings and feed them into curriculum and advocacy programs that they're developing. So that was just such a great opportunity for both of us. What we found really was that children are both very, obviously they inhabit a world in many countries in which witchcraft is real, but they were also very aware of the fact that witchcraft accusations were used in very deliberate ways, and that they didn't always stemmed from a belief that the particular person accused was a witch, but that it was a way of controlling people, a way of seeking revenge on people, and a really problematic practice as well. So that was, I think, a really encouraging, because it helped us to understand how we could develop, or how Stop Child Witch Accusations could develop programs to really make children think a lot more critically about the kinds of accusations that they were hearing.
Yeah, that's very true. As you know, like in Nigeria, Leo Igwe, one of the individuals that we've been much in contact with, He runs loads of seminars on critical thinking skills for children. So that's quite important. In addition, for example, in my own work, there is, for example, at my university, we have a virtual relationship with, which I discovered recently with universities in Uganda, whereby they teach children who have been victims of cats who need prosthetics. So they hold virtual workshop to outline what's a prosthetic, what's happened. So I'm trying to tap into that, to look into witchcraft investigation, to use the same facilities to teach young children, and also I'll tie in investigators in that, around investigating and harmful practices, locations and crime scenes and things like that. So that's another kind of area of advocacy that I'll be looking at as well.
And one of the things that we really are seeking to do, and just picking up on what Keith was saying about friendship benches and the community curriculum, we find that there are different experiments that are happening across the world to really think, how can we address this, particularly from a prevention perspective? And yet there hasn't been a lot of research done into the impact of those different interventions. So we often don't know which ones are working in which contexts, why are they working, how can they be replicated safely in other contexts. And so that is, again, another big area of work that we would really like to pursue. We're doing that in a small way through encouraging different organizations to write blog posts, to share just in those little bite-sized pieces the kinds of work that they're doing, so that others are at least aware of those and can follow up with them to get more information. But we are hoping to be able to do much more of a kind of a scoping study to look at what interventions do have an impact and why. So if anybody who is listening to this podcast has actually been involved in doing any very impactful interventions, please do get in touch with us so that we can write about it and we can hopefully investigate a little bit further.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else the International Network would like to share today? Or
I think there was a really great question in the chat, actually, and that's about witchcraft accusation, but in the global north. Because we often tend to think that this is a global south issue. I live in a part of England where actually the rates of abuse linked to faith and belief are very, very high, out of line with other parts of the country. And there are various reasons for that. But the question in the chat is from one of our colleagues who lives in Madeira and asks, shouldn't we also be addressing the issue of passing down of magical thinking from generation to generation? And that's something certainly that I've been thinking about around superstition and where do we draw the line between people going down to the local seaside here and going to speak to healers or going to speak to someone who'll cross someone's palm with silver and be told their fortune. Where is the line? And I think that's a really important question. And it links back to this question of belief and whether we need to tackle the belief systems or whether we just tackle the harmful consequences. And that's a very hot topic at the moment. We don't have a decision on that. I think as an organization, we haven't decided our stance on that yet, but certainly in the resolution says that we shouldn't be questioning people's beliefs. People are entitled to believe they wish, but where that leads to harm, that's where we really need to intervene.
We also had a question in the chat about the availability of the data. Miranda, is that data that you're recording, is that available?
No, so it's not available in the form of a global dashboard as yet. We're slowly doing that, working with very dedicated interns, but hopefully in the next couple of months, then certainly our historic data will become available and then we'll look to updating it. I should also say this issue of intergenerational transfer of belief. There's also intergenerational transfer of victimhood, unfortunately. And so we often find that children of those who have been accused of witchcraft or sorcery are themselves stigmatized, and that can then lead to violence as well. cutting off those intergenerational transfers is really, really important, which again is why working with children, I think, is so critical.
Yeah, I particularly support that statement. There's somebody whose father was around and often accused of witchcraft practices and also family members and etc. So to break that cycle is very, very difficult. So that's why I resonate with the aspects around education, around children. I've seen it in my own children. I've seen it in my own growing up. So breaking that cycle will be absolutely important. So that's a very, very good point, Miranda.
I also see Peter Minter from Total Life Enhancement Center in Ghana. He, of course, supports these multiple generational families in refugee camps. He's been the recipient of one of your project grants, and he's here and expressing his appreciation for the network.
Yeah, it's people like Peter that we really exist to support. Extraordinary the work that they're doing day in, day out. Him, but then also so many people around the world are risking their own lives on a really regular basis. Often people say to me, Miranda, why do you do this? Because it is so horrific. The sorts of violence that we learn about are just unthinkable in many cases. Why do this? But it's because of people like Peter that I get so much encouragement to think, well, if they're doing it, then actually what I'm doing is not nearly as significant a personal contribution as him and so many I know in Papua New Guinea who are just people who have very little, who still take survivors into their houses, who treat them as if they're family members, who put their own lives at danger by saying to the community, no, I'm caring for these people because they're human beings who have been hurt, who have been tortured, and I'm sharing my humanity. Often they're motivated by a sense of belief in God, and I am very inspired by that kind of behavior.
And I would just like to add, if it wasn't for people like you who have inspired me personally to really take a look at how this is still going on in the United States today. And because of your work, it's been an inspiration, well, not only to me, but to my other board members, our other board members at End Witch Hunts, that we've been able to see how it does and how it does affect us still today, that it didn't end in 1692 for us. And now to raise awareness in the United States, not only for our own country, but for everybody else too, globally. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Mary.
We have one more moment to address one other level of this complexity. Naveen here, who is a research scholar from India and anti-superstitious law, he says, regarding how to combat witchcraft practices alone when these practices are also connected with other religious beliefs, should we also address other connected practices and the roots of superstitious practices?
So this is something that I've been involved in over the last 4 to 5 years with a particular focus on disability, but it's addressing the whole spectrum of beliefs, or what we've called alternative explanations, because many of these intersect and many of them are held simultaneously. So someone may be a well-educated person. They may well understand that their child has a genetic condition. They will still take them to church to be healed. They'll still take them to the traditional healer or even a witch doctor because they're exploring every opportunity in a context where there are very few opportunities to really find a solution. So I think it's important that we do think about this issue in the wider context and how it intersects with other beliefs and belief systems. Absolutely.
Thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing the powerful impact you're creating through your organization.
What we've heard today reinforces why organizations around the world are coming together to address witchcraft accusations and create change.
When you're ready to learn more and support this work, please do not hesitate to reach out to either us at End Witch Hunts or to INAWARA
You can find educational resources at internationalnetwork.org, featuring the work of today's panelist organizations alongside research reports and articles from advocates and experts worldwide. At End Witch Hunts nonprofit, our vision is a world without witch hunts, where victims and their families receive justice, acknowledgement, and support.
You can find our podcasts, research, and ways to get involved at endwitchhunts.org. Together we can create a world without these violations of human dignity.
Thank you for joining us today. Please keep this conversation growing by sharing what you learned with others.